Hello, I'm Kenny Bailey, Agriculture Extension Agent with the Cumberland County Center of North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Today, my colleague Jessica Drake, our 4-H agent, and I are going to talk with you about bees, their importance, some of the products that we can get from bees, as well as we're going to have a demonstration later on how to use beeswax to make some moisturizer bars. So let's dive into our program and talk a little bit about bees. The way we're going to go here today is we're going to talk about bees in general, because bees, the class that we term bees, covers a lot of different insects in the world. And so we want to start out in general with bees and then focus down on honeybees and finally focus down on the products that come from the beehives, ultimately talking about beeswax. Worldwide, we know of over 20,000 species of insects that we call bees. In North Carolina, you can find about 500 of these species. And so with having that knowledge, I want to point out a book to you that's put out by NC State University Extension called The Bees of North Carolina. You can purchase this book through UNC Press. If you go to uncpress.org, you can order this book, and it covers the identifying the native bees that we have here in North Carolina. Another good book that's free that you can get through the USDA Forestry Service online is called Bee Basics, an Introduction to Our Native Bees. You can get this in PDF format online. If you'll Google USDA Bee Basics, it will pull up the website where you can obtain a copy of that file, Bee Basics, an Introduction to Our Native Bees. So now that we've pointed out that we have so many different species of bees in the world, and 500 of those species we can see here in North Carolina, let's talk about what makes a bee a bee. What puts these insects in the category of bees, and contrast that with wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets. First of all, a bee is an insect. And the basic definition of an insect, it has 3 body parts with 6 legs. All insects, particularly in their adult form, has a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And then they'll have 3 pairs of legs attached to the thorax, which is the middle section of an insect body. Now, this is different from, say, the arachnids or the spiders that have 8 legs. So if it's got 6 legs, it's an insect, and that's the group that bees fall under. Now, within the insect world, bees fall under an order called Hymenoptera. Now, other members of the Hymenoptera group include wasps, hornets, yellow jackets, and ants. So bees belong to a diverse group of organisms within the insect kingdom. So what distinguishes a bee from a wasp or a hornet or a yellow jacket? Well, first of all, bees are strictly vegetarian. They get all of their food from plants. And they get it in the form of nectar, which is their carbohydrate source. And they get pollen, which is their protein source. So all a bee's food comes from plants. Now, wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets, on the other hand, they do get some food from plants. That includes the nectar. But primarily their protein source is other insects. So they are beneficial in that they are predators of some of our bad insects. So they get their protein from caterpillars and grub worms and other insects that that cause us some issues. Both bees and wasps contribute a little bit to pollination, but wasps are more indirectly as pollinators. They're not as important as pollinators as bees are, but they are important as being predators of some bad insects. Bees, on the other hand, they deliberately collect pollen, bring it back to the hive. When that pollen sticks to their coat, just as we might see here in this poster, that's pollen that's on the body of the bee. When that bee goes to another flower, it will drop that pollen off onto the flower and thus performing the pollination service. Another thing that bees and wasps do have in common, though, is the sting. Now, not all bees sting. Some bees will bite, but nearly all of them sting, and nearly all of the wasp and hornets and yellow jackets sting. The purpose of the sting is to defend the colony. And when one of these insects stings you, that gets you two ways. One is the initial penetration of the stinger into the skin, which is like having a hypodermic needle sticking in you. And the second part of the pain, and the majority of the pain, comes from the venom that's injected into your body when those insects sting you. And of course, that venom, about 5% of the population is allergic to that venom, and so have to be aware of the possibility of the danger of getting stung by these insects due to their possibility of going into anaphylactic shock. Now, the reason insects sting is to protect their nest. You may get stung accidentally if you step on one or mash one, but if it's an aggressive sting or multiple stings, it's usually from you have disturbed their nest and they feel like you are a threat. They don't fly around going around looking for people to sting. They sting in defense of their colony. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about honeybees later on, but while we're on the subject of stings, of all the species of bees and wasps in the world, it's the honeybees are the ones that leave their stingers behind if you're stung. And you'll only get stung one time by a honeybee. The reason behind this is the honeybee sting, on the end of it, they have barbs. If you're a fisherman or fisher person, and familiar with fish hooks and the barbs that they have on them that prevent the fish from spitting the hook out of their mouth when they're caught. This is very similar to what you see in a honeybee stinger. That barb, when it gets injected into the skin, gets stuck. When the bee pulls away, it pulls the stinger out, and the bee's going to eventually die. Only honeybees do this. All the other bees that sting and all the wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets, they've got a smooth stinger, and they can sting you over and over again, whereas a honeybee can only sting you one time. Let's talk a little bit about what makes a bee species a honeybee species. There's only 4 species in the world that are considered to be honeybee species. The majority of your bees, and even into your wasps and hornets and yellow jackets, the only individuals that live through the wintertime are mated queens. In the case of a honeybee species, the entire colony goes through the wintertime. And because of that, they have to store food to get them through the times when nothing is in bloom. And so they do this in the form of honey. That's why they're called honeybees. Of those 4 species, none of them are native to North or South America. We thought that there may have been a native honeybee species in the American continent at one time, but the only evidence we have of that is in the fossil record. So as we know right now, there are no native honeybee species. And the honeybee that we use, and 99% of the world uses to make honey and collect pollen and use for pollination services, that's kept by bees, is the European honeybee. So if you see a honeybee here in North Carolina, it will be the European honeybee. And so with that, we're going to focus on the European honeybee, since it is the one that we keep in our beehives, and it's also the one that we get honey from and the other products. When we talk about honeybees, we want to distinguish the three different castes that we will find in a honeybee colony. Now, two of those castes are female and the other one is male. The first one I want to talk about is the queen. Now, the queen is the mother of all the bees in the hive. She is a female, and she is fully developed and fully capable of mating and reproducing. This is different from the workers that we're going to talk about in just a minute. They are female, but they're not fully developed. Queen is fully developed. There's usually only one per hive. Her only task is to reproduce, to lay eggs. And in the busiest time of the season, when they're making honey or getting prepared to make honey, or to gather nectar for making honey, is she'll lay about 2,000 eggs a day. And she has to do that in order to be able to maintain the population of the bee colony or to increase the population of the bee colony. Because on average, a bee colony loses about 1,500 worker bees per day. So she has to lay that number of eggs just to keep up with the dwindling population and keep it going. When we look for a honeybee queen, she is usually longer than the other bees, the workers and the males. And she has a smooth thorax that makes it shiny. So when we look for a queen, we look for a long-bodied bee with a shiny thorax. Now the queen, most time, only time that people see queens are the beekeepers, because queens do not go out and fly around from flower to flower collecting nectar and pollen. The only time a queen comes out is when she is mating or if she is swarming. So very rarely will the average person see a queen unless they visit a beekeeper. Now, by far, the vast majority of the bees in a honeybee colony are the workers. Whereas there's only one queen, there may be 30 to 60,000 workers in that colony if they are healthy. And they get the name worker because they simply do all the work that's involved in the bee colony except for reproduction. They are female, but they're not fully developed females, so they're not capable of reproducing like the queen. They do everything that's involved in maintaining the hive, from going out and collecting the nectar and the pollen, to building the nest, to taking care of the young, to taking care of the queen, to guarding the hive, and even to maintaining the temperature of the hive, cleaning it up. Everything that has to be done to that colony other than reproduction is done by the workers. Because of this, the workers simply work themselves to death, and during the busy part of the season, their average lifespan is only about 6 weeks, which is very small compared to the queen, which lives an average of about 2 to 3 years. So they're very short-lived insects. They're constantly needing to be replaced. So that's why it's important for a colony to have a good, strong laying queen. Now the last caste is the male caste, and we call them drones when we're talking about bees. The only job of the male bee, the drone, is for reproduction. They don't even have a stinger. They're not even capable of stinging you. And they're not they're useless when it comes to garden hive. The only thing they do is they mate. And they're only going to live 1 year as compared to the queen. If they're lucky enough to mate during the season, they die immediately after mating. If they don't mate, they get kicked out in the wintertime and they die from exposure. So they're one way or the other, they're only going to live 1 year, 1 season. And the reason behind that is queens, mated queens, have the capability of laying either a fertilized egg or an unfertilized egg. It's her choice. And so male bees are the result of unfertilized eggs. So all they have to do in the springtime when they're ready to start reproducing again is she can start producing drones again in the springtime. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of honeybees. Insects go through 2 types of life cycle development. It's either going to be gradual metamorphosis or it's going to be complete metamorphosis. And bees go through a development called complete metamorphosis. Most everybody that's listening to this are probably familiar with the life cycles of a butterfly or a moth, and they also go through complete metamorphosis. 4 distinct stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. In a butterfly or moth, starts out as an egg that's laid by the adult. That egg hatches out into a larva that we call caterpillars. And then whether it's a butterfly, if it's a butterfly, when it goes into the pupal stage, it spins a chrysalid. If it's a moth, we call it a cocoon. And after it spends a certain amount of time in that pupal stage, then it will emerge as a full-grown adult butterfly or moth. Well, the honeybee and other bee species go through this same type of development. And they start out as an egg, which hatches out into a grub-like larva. Then eventually it goes into a pupal stage. And finally it emerges as a full-grown adult honeybee. Now all this is taking place inside the honeycomb, which I happen to have a picture of what a honeycomb looks like. The honeycomb is used not only for storing the honey, but they also store a place where the queen will lay the eggs and rear the young. So all that development takes place inside the honeycomb, which is, by the way, is made out of wax. And here I have some natural honeycomb that came out of a colony. So that's basically the life cycle of the honeybee. What I want to do now is talk about some of the things that honeybees collect. What are they doing when you see them out there flying around the flowers and other areas, and want to relay that to some of the things that they make from what they collect and what they use. And then finally, talk about some of the products that we can get from a beehive other than honey that we get as a result of their activity. So there's basically 4 things that honeybees collect when they're out in the wild. It's nectar, pollen, propolis, and water. When you see them going from flower to flower, they're going for 2 reasons. To collect pollen or collect nectar, or to collect both while they're out there on the flowers. Now nectar is a watery, sugary solution that you'll find in flowers. If you've ever broken a flower apart and found that liquid substance in the base of it, that's nectar. That's what the bees are collecting, and that's what they process into honey. And that's their carbohydrate source. The second thing they're collecting is the pollen. Now the pollen is the male reproductive structure of flowers, of plants, and the bees collect this, bring it back to the hive, and they use it as their protein source for feeding the young bees. In the process of collecting pollen also, they are moving that pollen from flower to flower which is necessary for pollination to take place. The third thing they collect is tree sap that I called propolis earlier. But propolis is nothing but tree sap. And they'll go to trees and shrubs looking for wounds that may be exuding this sap. They collect it, bring it back to the hive, and they use it to seal in cracks that may be in the hive to prevent the cold air from coming in there. So that's one way that they maintain their temperature in the wintertime. The fourth thing that they collect is water. So it's important for bees to have a good source of water in their area. And they use water for two reasons. One is to thin the honey before they feed it to the young bees. And the second reason they collect water is they use it to maintain the temperature in the hive during the summertime. They'll take drops of water and place it throughout the hive. They'll get a air current going through the hive using their wings, and the evaporation of those little droplets of water will actually cool the hive down. So they're very good at maintaining their temperature both in the winter and in the summer. So those are the things that they collect. I want to talk now about what they make out of some of these things that they collect. The first thing is nectar. Nectar is what they process into honey. So when you're eating honey, you're consuming nectar that's been processed by the bees into honey. Now, nectar is a weak, sugary substance. And what the bees do, the sugar in it is complex. And so they add enzymes to that sugar to break that sugar in the nectar down into simple sugars, which are sweeter. Simple sugars are sweeter than complex sugars. When we think of a complex sugar, we're thinking something like the sugar that's in a baked potato or in a vegetable. They break it down into a more simple sugar, similar to what we use as table sugar. But the first thing they do is they add those enzymes to break that sugar down. They bring that nectar that's had the enzymes added to it back to the hive, and then they evaporate the moisture out of it. And once they have evaporated that moisture down to 18% or less, we consider that to be ripe honey. And that's the honey that they consume as well as we can consume. We know honey is ripe when we go into a hive and we find that the cells that the honey's being stored in is capped over with beeswax. And once we have enough of those cells capped over that we feel sufficient, about 70, 80% at least, we know that honey is ripe and ready to harvest and consume. If you consume too much green honey, as we call the unripe honey, it has the same effect as eating a green apple. It can give you a bellyache, so we don't want to eat too much of that green honey. Now the pollen, only thing they do with the pollen is they make what's called bee bread. They'll mix a little bit of pollen together with honey, put that in the cells near the young developing bees, and then they'll feed that pollen to the young developing bees over time. The propolis, again, it's used to seal in cracks in the hive and to aggravate the beekeepers that's trying to open the beehive when they need to go in there. And of course the water is used to dilute the honey prior to feeding it to the young bees. Now, having said all this, there's products that we can get from beehive and from these colonies that we can use. We're all familiar with honey. Most of us are familiar with the liquid honey that we find in jars that's sold in the supermarkets. But honey is actually marketed in other ways that you may not see in your typical supermarket. One way is some of the honeycomb may be placed in the jar, and then that jar finish filling it up with liquid honey. We call that chunk comb honey. And usually you won't find that in the supermarkets. You'll find that at a farmer's market or a roadside stand or a specialty store. And then some people like to buy honey that's still in the comb. Sometimes you can get honey that's been cut, the comb has been cut into squares and placed into clear plastic containers. We call that cut comb honey. Some forms of honey that's very similar to cut comb honey is called section comb honey, where the beekeeper has actually put the container in the hive and the bees make the comb in that container, and all we do is pop it out of the hive and seal it up and sell it that way. Then you got some folks that absolutely don't want anything done to their honey. They'll go to the beekeeper and buy the honey that's still in the frame that's used in the beehive, and we call that bulk comb honey. So those are different ways of harvesting honey. Now, I can tell you, as a beekeeper myself, there's nothing like pulling a piece of that comb out of the hive and nothing been done to it, and chew that comb and get the honey out that way. There's nothing like that flavor compared to what you may buy in a jar somewhere from a supermarket. The pollen can also be sold as a product for human consumption. Sometimes you'll find that in the form of capsules or tablets in a health food store. Sometimes you can buy the raw pollen. And people consume this for two reasons. One, as a protein supplement, and the other reason is hopes that this pollen may help with their allergies. So those are reasons why people may buy pollen, either directly from the beekeeper or from a health food store. You can also buy Propolis. You can buy that in the form of capsules or tablets from a health food store. It's thought to have some medicinal purposes. And then there's also other uses of honey that we don't necessarily consume the honey directly. Honey wine, which we call Mead, considered to be one of the oldest methods of making wine. Even before grapes and other fruit was used to make wine, mankind was making wine out of honey. We call that Mead. You can make honey beer. You can make honey vinegar. And of course, honey is used in a lot of different cakes and pies and other goodies that we buy. We may not always realize that there's honey in those products, but it is used a lot in cooking. So that brings me down to the final product that I want to talk about, and gives us a segue into the project here that Jessica's going to do here in a few minutes, and that's beeswax. Now, beeswax is a substance that's made by the bees. It's not anything that's collected. It's made by the bees, made by special glands in the head of the bee. And when these bees are making wax, it looks like little fish scales of wax secreting out of their body. And then the bees will take that beeswax and they'll make the nest out of it, like we see here in this picture of the honeycomb. But beekeepers can harvest it and sell it, and it's used in a wide variety of different products. The most familiar product that people think about with beeswax is beeswax candles, but there's a lot of other things that beeswax is used in. Beeswax is used in car wax, furniture polish, cosmetics. If you play a stringed instrument like the violin or the cello or the bass, you heard the term rosin up your bow. Well, that rosin that you're using is usually a form of beeswax. If you're into archery, what you use to rosin your bowstring in a lot of cases is beeswax. So there's some various ways that beeswax is used. One of the more famous ways that beeswax is used, other than in beeswax candles, is lip balm. And we know some companies that have really made beeswax famous, making lip balm and other products and moisturizers using the beeswax. So everywhere you turn around, you'll see various ways that beeswax is being used, not just being used for beeswax candles. So that leads me here, a segue into our demo that we're going to do here today. Jessica is going to demonstrate how to use beeswax to make moisturizer bars that you can use to rub on your skin if you have dry skin, or you have rough spots on your skin. You can take these bars and rub it on there, and it will moisturize it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Good afternoon, I'm Jessica Drake. I'm the 4-H agent here at Cumberland County, and I have been so thrilled to hear all the stuff that Kenny has shared with you about bees. So my job, of course, is working with youth, and so one of the great things that I get to do is share my passion for our pollinators and our bees and our butterflies. And we have, over the past couple years, have come up with a couple of activities that the youth have really enjoyed, but adults have enjoyed these too. So I wanted to come and share with you a couple of items that you can actually make on your own utilizing the wonderful beeswax that Kenny was talking about. So, quick question, do you know how old the oldest specimen of known honey and wax is? If you guess it's almost 3,000 years old and from ancient Egypt, then you are correct. I just find it fascinating that that both honey and wax has no timeline. It has no, it can be used and preserved over forever, and is a great, both of those items are great products that we can use in our everyday lives. So let's talk about a little bit about what we're going to do today. Kenny mentioned that we're going to make a lotion bar. So here's my lotion bar that I created the other day. And this has been used quite a couple times. And what it does, it just provides some moisture for your hands or for your elbows if you're like me, or anywhere, especially that cold, whenever we have the heater going, it tends to dry out our skin. So this is a great thing to have on hand. And plus it makes a good little gift for your neighbors or friends. And so in order to make this lotion bar, you need a couple of items. We need coconut oil. We can use, I have shea butter here, but you could also use cocoa butter. And then last but not least, like we were talking about, we have our beeswax. Now this beeswax actually is formed in little pellets, and it is very much easier to work with than, say, getting a whole cube of wax. But they're both readily available. I like to use the unfiltered natural beeswax whenever I do my my lotion bars, or like Kenny was saying, like lip gloss and stuff like that. You can actually utilize this same recipe, just add a little bit extra coconut oil, and you can actually make your own lip balm with this as well. So if you don't have the pellet beeswax, you will need a box grater or just a regular grater like this in order to chop up the beeswax. You will need just a basic scale. If you don't have a scale, you can measure this out by volume, so it's really kind of either or there. You will need whatever kind of essential oil that you enjoy. I, for one, love the smell of peppermint, and I use it all year round. It kind of reminds me of Christmas and gives me the warm fuzzies with that. but I just think it's a very refreshing scent and it's not overpowering. So you'll make sure that you have your essential oils on hand to be able to utilize that in this recipe. So I keep on saying this recipe. So what we are going to do is I've got 2 jars already in the microwave, but you could do this a number of ways. We want to make sure that we create a homogeneous solution. So that means that everything is equally distributed. And so the way that we're going to do that is we're going to melt down our raw materials of the shea butter, the coconut oil, and the beeswax. And the way that we're going to do that today is by using the microwave. You can definitely use a double boiler, or you could even use a crock pot. I would just make sure that you line everything so that it's for easy cleanup, or just use certain items that you can devote to your beeswax working, so we don't have to worry about getting all the leftover beeswax off of everything. So I'm going to come over here real quick and I've got my shea butter here. I also have my my beeswax and my coconut oil over here. So your beeswax actually has a higher melting point than, say, your coconut oil or your shea butter. So I actually had that in for a few minutes starting before we started today. And I'm going to go ahead and put that back on. And while that microwave is running, I'm going to go over a couple of other things that you could use beeswax for. Like Kenny said, definitely for lip gloss or lip balm. But, you know, we're in the day of recycle, reduce, reuse. I wanted to share with you a cool little activity, or a cool little item that you could make is a reusable food wrap. There are antibacterial and antimicrobial elements in the beeswax. That's why it lasts for over 3,000 years. But it's also great to use, you know, wrapping food, or so that you don't have to use plastic or paper. But this is something that you can reuse time and time again. I'm going to show you with our little lotion bar here. So just imagine this was an apple or a plum that you were taking with you to the office. And you can easily just wrap that in that wrap, wrap that in that wrap, and you can have your food or your sandwich or your snack readily available in a reusable container. Now, the second thing that you could do very easily would be creating a candle. Of course, we think of wax and candles, but what a cool way to utilize different types of essential oils, your basic beeswax, simple melting process, adding that scent to that, and then sticking a wick down in the center. So safety first, we want to make sure that we have a hot pad. So I've got my beeswax, my shea butter, and my coconut oil. And so with our shea butter, you can also switch out cocoa butter for this. And actually, doing the cocoa butter and the peppermint really gives you a really cool little chocolate mint smell. So definitely recommend that if you want to try that out, or if you have the coconut butter or the cocoa butter on hand instead. So like we said before, I wanted to do this actually by weight instead of just by volume. So I'm going to put my pouring jar, and again, this is one that I have devoted just for activities, including my beeswax, so I don't have to worry about you know, having to clean everything 100%. And we are actually making some stuff earlier, so that's why there's some on there. But I'm going to grab my coconut oil, and I'm going to just put about 2 ounces in here. Coconut oil. Put my shea butter. And again, we want that homogeneous, or that everything to mix in together. And beeswax. Now, depending on There we go, perfect. Depending on the weather, depending on, you know, how humid things are, your lotion bars might turn out a little different. If you find that your lotion bar is a little sticky or tacky feeling, you might want to pull back a little bit on the shea butter. If you feel like it's a little greasy or oily after you put it on, you might want to back up a little bit on the coconut oil. But again, this is just the base recipe or the base guidance. And so whenever I put in my essential oils, I always use about 20 drops. Now, whenever you buy essential oils, you can do one of two things. You could purchase therapeutic grade or food grade. With therapeutic grade, it might not be as refined as the food grade, and it's not recommended for consumption. So because I never know whenever I purchase stuff like this what the end product might be, I always opt for the food grade, because then I know I can use it in my chapsticks, my lip balms, that kind of thing, as well as a fragrance enhancer. So as you see, we have our beeswax, our coconut oil, and our shea butter in here. And here I have some little silicone, they're actually cupcake holders, but I like to use silicone as a mold just because they're easily popped out whenever your lotion bars are complete. But you can feel free to use any kind of mold that you would like to. And so within these, we're just going to fill these up with our mixture. And it'll probably take anywhere from an hour or two for these to harden completely. You can always put them in the refrigerator or the freezer to speeden up this process. But there you have it. Once those harden and cool down and solidify, you'll have something akin to this, our lotion moisturizing bar. And again, this is just the base. You can always add different flavors, different smells, that kind of thing, to make this all your own. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've learned a little something today, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Have a great day.